Hello there and welcome to this vodcast from EF Brisbane. This week we're looking at the deep history of Australia before European arrival. We're looking at the history of the Aboriginal people, our native people, a people with a very long, in fact the longest continuous culture. In this slide you can see the route that the Aboriginals took out of Africa. We'll start off with India. So Africa is out here towards the left. They walked around the coast. At the time that they left Africa, the oceans were lower.
Thank you, AJ. And now let's look in a little bit more detail about how these people came to Australia and why it's such an important part of not only Australian history, but anthropology world history. And as AJ said, this exodus from Africa, this exit of old man walking across many continents into Australia, happened a long time ago. The arrival of these people in Australia took tens of thousands of years, and they believe that the arrival was somewhere between 125 and 40,000 years ago. Most anthropologists believe this was actually about 60,000 years ago. And as such, once these Aboriginal people arrived in Australia, and then the oceans around them became less shallow, and then cut off Australia from some of the islands further north, this isolated the continent and these Aboriginal people. And this is why they are the oldest living human culture on Earth. There are other old cultures, but some of these rose, thrived, but then declined and died out. And the Aboriginal people, once they were here and those oceans became deeper and cut them off, their culture became totally isolated from those around them, which is incredibly interesting. And this is why they're so culturally very distinct. We do have other cultures around them, across here from New Zealand, up through Tonga, Fiji, Samoa, Tahiti, Hawaii, Micronesia, the Solomon Islands, across through Indonesia and across to Madagascar. We have an incredible Malay Polynesian culture that has some aspects very much in common. But they are not part of the culture that developed in Australia. And so the religion, the physicality of our Aboriginal people and their social or society structure remained very unique and very distinct from everybody around them. Incredibly interesting for anthropologists and also for Australians.
When the Europeans arrived in Australia, they called it Terra Nullius, or essentially no man's land. They said that they recognised that Aboriginal people were living here, but they didn't regard them as a people that actually had a connection to the land. They didn't regard them as a people that had done anything to the land. The reason is because Aboriginal people did not shape their environment the same way that Europeans.
We're going to look at now at the population of Australia by our first people, by our Aboriginal people. And the anthropologists believe that this did vary over time, and it changed from somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million. And they chose 1 million as the possible highest number of Aboriginal people that could live on the continent because of their lifestyle. They didn't grow crops. The growing of crops and the tools used to grow crops and the process of a society kind of staying in one area and developing farming methods, this was not part of their culture. The whole agricultural part of other societies grew after the Aboriginal people had left Africa. And so the Aboriginal people had never ever had any knowledge or experience of crop growing. And they didn't develop it once they got here. They were really just hunters and gatherers. They hunted animals, they fished, they killed birds, they ate eggs, they gathered any fruit or vegetables or even honey that was available to them, but they did not grow crops. And so 1 million, they believe, is the largest amount possible as hunters and gatherers. The estimate of full-blooded Aboriginals in 1788 was put at 315,000 people. Quite difficult to estimate because in those years they weren't really going into the interior of Australia, into the desert areas and doing a very accurate count. In 1938, though, when they did more serious counting, there were only about 70,000 Aboriginal people. Some historians believe that this was because when there were clashes between the new arrivals, the Europeans, and the first Australians, that the weaponry of the Europeans, being guns, was far superior to spears, and in any clashes, obviously the Europeans would be superior and would kill a lot more of the Aboriginal people. But there was something that was far more deadly than the weaponry, and that was illness, disease. The Europeans brought with them not only things like the common cold and flu, but other diseases such as smallpox, cholera, typhoid. Even the cold or flu could wipe out an entire Aboriginal tribal group, because this Aboriginal people had no resistance whatsoever to even these kind of common diseases. So as the Europeans moved into different areas, brought with them new diseases, this wiped out lots and lots of people. Today they believe that there are about 600,000 full-blooded Aboriginal people, and this is what we call Aboriginality. To be full-blooded means that at least one of your great-grandparents has some Aboriginal full blood. Many of the people who call themselves Aboriginal today will have blonde hair, blue eyes, red hair, so that as they became integrated with Europeans and other nationalities, they are still called Aboriginal, but the mixing of races has changed the appearance. We're going to look a little bit more in detail about living with the land. And we know that the Aboriginal people didn't have permanent settlements. They were very much nomadic people. And this meant that they were hunters and gatherers. They moved according to the season where there was animal reproduction. As hunters, they followed the animals. If they knew it was the breeding season of a particular animal, they would kind of move on to that area so that meat and hunting became easier. If it was a certain fishing time of year where some fish were breeding, then they would move to that ocean area or to that river area. So again, that fishing would be much easier. And the same goes with some of the yams and things that grew in the ground, or where honey was readily available. So as hunters and gatherers, they just moved according to the seasons. To hunt, they used three distinct types of weapons. One is the boomerang, and of course this is the most commonly known weapon that the Aboriginal people used. It was thrown very, very accurately and could kill an animal such as a kangaroo from a great distance. There was also a woomera, which was a shield to protect them if they were hunting an animal that became a little bit vicious in return. And also, of course, they hunted with spears, which were a very, very common weapon through many different societies. The Aboriginal people living with the land did not leave a footprint, and this is very, very much part of their religion. They really believed that the land was given to them just to look after for a short time. And so wherever they went, they didn't leave a footprint. And this means, for example, that they didn't build, when they prayed or when they had their religious beliefs, they didn't build any structures that showed that this was a religious area. From social group to social group, down through the generations, they passed on this information word of mouth that a certain area or a certain cave or a certain part of a river was a sacred site, a religious sacred site, but they didn't ever build anything there. When they moved as nomads as well, for example, if they had fires that they were using to do the cooking of any meat they had caught, they would scatter any of the stones or any of the ashes left from the fire so that when they left, the world was as perfect and as clean in that area as when they arrived. And so for them, showing respect to the land and feeling that they are being one with the land was very, very important. And as we said, there was no footprint that was being left behind. They seldom wore clothing. They didn't need to. Any food or any animal they killed was for food only. If they live right down the bottom of Australia in Tasmania or in Victoria, they would sometimes use some of the skins to help keep them warm. But most of the Aboriginal people who lived in the inland, desert areas, northern Australia, did not have the need for clothing. They did have a really good system of communication, and this was through a bull roarer, which was a type of a wooden instrument that just made a very, very high-pitched noise. And they used this to communicate from group to group or individual to individual across long distances. So their relationship with the land was respect and leaving it pure and not building any structures that changed the format of the land. We're now going to look at another aspect of the Aboriginal society, and this was with all the tribes right across Australia throughout their history on the land, and that was controlled burning. And they did control burning for several reasons. One, sometimes they would use controlled burning to get rid of old dead grass and encourage new grass to grow, and that would bring animals, and then the animals would be much easier for them to hunt. But in general, their controlled burning was also in respect of the land. So what they wanted to do was to prevent forest fires. And across the thousands and thousands of years that they inhabited the land, fire, most often through lightning strikes, was going to be something that was going to be very damaging to the land. And they discovered that over their tens of thousands of years, that if they got rid of any of the dry grass, any of the dead wood, and then also did some controlled burning, they would start a fire and only burn all of the dead grass and the dead wood, then this would stop a huge forest fire from occurring a little bit later on. So most of the time they didn't need to do the burning, but they did controlled burning, as we can see here, in order to protect the land from a raging bushfire a little bit later. And of course this encouraged the right grass to grow, animals would come back. It would also prevent flooding. So the fire hunting and the cooking part of their controlled burning in every culture, every tribal group right across the country of Australia. We're now going to look at the religion of the Aboriginal people. And even though there were many tribes that existed from east to west, and these tribes were different in the way that they had tribal beliefs and customs, when it came to religion, they were fairly much identical. They were polytheists, and they did believe that the God can be seen everywhere, and you can recognize him. For example, a river could be the track of a giant snake, or a small valley could be the footprint of a giant human being, and a lake could be due to the tears of some warrior who had died or lost his beloved. These beliefs were actually very similar to beliefs in Europe and all the other nations in very early times. You would have stories as to why a mountain came into existence or why there was a valley. So what happened with the Aboriginal people, very similar, but of course these beliefs and cultures kept being passed from generation to generation because of their isolation. And also very, very important to the Aboriginal people is that there is reincarnation, that animals and humans have to be seen as equal. So that if someone died, reincarnation, you get born again. And if you died, you could reincarnate as a platypus, a koala, a wombat, a kangaroo. And part of this belief in reincarnation did mean that the Aboriginal people did not kill any animal where it wasn't necessary. They only killed for food. And this is also why they didn't have herds of animals that they kept, and that they killed perhaps unnecessarily for skin. If they didn't really need the warmth of clothing, then don't kill the animal. So animals and humans are equal, because reincarnation between humans and animals was a part of what they believed in. They also believed that the world was created perfectly, as we said before, so that the land should not be changed. As we said, if you were living in a place, you didn't cut down trees, you did not build a house, because you didn't need to do this. You were warm enough. You only gathered wood that was already dead and had fallen from a tree to make a fire. You did not cut down trees to make a fire, so only dead wood could be used. If you moved on, you left the land exactly as it was before you arrived. So there were no trees cut down, not necessary, no houses built, not necessary, and no religious places or shrines or buildings created, because it just was not necessary. Even in making their weapons, they also used wood that had already died, and the same with musical instruments. So very, very important that the land had to be respected. And in this way, even today, the Aboriginal people feel they have a very, very close tie with the land, and land is a very, very important part of their culture. There are also specific rules for people after they died. From tribe to tribe, this differed a little bit, but in general, after death, there were special smoke ceremonies and rituals. The person who had died, you couldn't use their name and talk about them using their name. You had to be very careful. And they would not ever like to see a picture of someone who had died. And for a lot of our Torres Strait Aboriginal people, this is still very, very strong today. That nowadays, when we have all the technology on phones and cameras and film to kind of capture people who maybe even famous sports people or famous political people, they cannot ever see that person in film or picture form again. When we watch TV in Australia, and perhaps there's going to be somebody shown on the TV who is from an Aboriginal society, there'll be a warning saying, warning, this may be not acceptable for some of our Torres Islander and Torres Strait people, and they know that they turn off, they don't watch the whatever's coming up next on the TV. So an important part of their religion. We're now going to look at the Aboriginal concept of the dream time. And the dream time, I suppose, is very similar to our concept of the story of Adam and Eve. And it goes back into time before the time we live in now existed. So the creation time. So the dream time is all about how the world was formed long ago in the time before time. To an extent, it explains why the world is the way that it is today, why there are mountains, why there are oceans, why there are lakes that have been created in certain places. So a lot of what we would call folklore are part of the dream time. It also explains how the Aboriginal people, as peoples, knew how to find fish under the ocean, how they understood how to, a honey hive or a beehive had honey on the inside that the Aboriginal people could learn to eat, and how they understood what plants could be dug up and you would find a huge root underneath the ground that was edible, like a yam. So it was explaining how knowledge about living with the land came to the Aboriginal people. So the dream time, a very important way of explaining how and why the world is today, and why the Aboriginal people themselves also have to still protect the land, read the land, and the different rules for living. One of the things that the Aboriginal peoples right across the continent did have in common was art. Now, even though they were hunters and gatherers and respected the land, art was one thing that was part of their culture, although it wasn't used to create things, as I said, to adorn the land. The way that they created most of their art is in a style that's called dot painting. and this is their particular style of painting, and probably only used by the Aboriginal people from any other, compared with any other societies on Earth, and it's the most highly recognised form. There are some parts of the Northern Territory and inland Australia where this dot painting still exists in its natural form. In all of these paintings, yellow was for the sun, brown and black were for the soil, red was for the desert sands, and white was for the clouds or skies. They did have both animals and natural things that they painted, and all of them were representations of life. In their paintings, you'll find maps as well. So a painting can be a map of where to find food and what plant or animal was found in certain places. Previously, we've said that they didn't ever leave buildings and things to show where they had been before on the surface of the land. But inside caves, this was considered to be different. And if you go into many of the places, for example, in the Northern Territory, in the areas of Kakadu, you can see some of the most amazing rock paintings and cave paintings. And this is where some of these religious maps on where to find food and what animals were to be found, how they hunted, what weapons they used. There's a whole history of Aboriginality in some of these caves. There were specific roles about who painted what, and you can see a young child here being painted for a ceremony. They were always painted when there were special dances being held as a celebration, or after someone had died, or for a marriage. As I said, they painted in the caves, and they also painted some of their weapons. And sometimes the women did this painting, but sometimes the painting was only to be done by the men. And this changed a little bit from tribal group to tribal group as you moved across the country. We're now going to look at music and dance. And what we're seeing here on the right-hand side is the didgeridoo. It is one of the most well-known Australian instruments, even though it is only relatively new. They think it's only a few thousand years old. It does come in a range of sizes, from quite short to quite long. The didgeridoo is only to be played by the men, but it's also only to be made by the women. And the women have a very clever way of making the didgeridoo. They get a piece of solid wood and they take this to a termite mound. And a termite is a small ant-like creature that only eats wood. They place this piece of wood in a termite mound and they leave it for a period of time. And when they come back, the termites have eaten the entire inside of the wood, which is then hollow and can be used as a religious instrument, the didgeridoo. The women then paint the outside of the didgeridoo, and it then becomes an instrument that the men can use. They also make clapsticks, which are like a percussion for any music that they play. The dances they perform are told from the Dreamtime, and these are, once again, to retell the stories, but in a dance form. A lot of the Dreamtime, you might remember, we said included how animals came into creation, and also the relationship between humans and animals. And it's really obvious when you watch them dance that a performer is playing the role of an emu or a bird, a galah, or a kangaroo. And so their dancers are humans, and also some of them will be performing the roles of the animals in the Dreamtime stories. The dances that they perform can be very gender specific. In other words, some dances are only to be watched by men, others only to be watched by the women, and some are also a secret. They could only be performed, for example, for a men's ritual, could only be performed by that time, and women are just not ever allowed to be able to see them. So the dances, like most things that have a religious aspect, have a very, very quite a strict role about when they're performed, who performs, and who watches. We're now going to look at women in society in the Aboriginal groups. And in the very early years, in the formative years, male and females were treated the same. They were nurtured, loved, looked after equally despite the fact whether they're male or female. As they reached the formative years, though, the games that they played were according to the sexes. This was very similar, I suppose, to all societies around the globe. In Western culture, young boys were often given toys, toy cars and trucks and trains to play with, and girls were given dolls to dress up. And very similar in the Aboriginal societies. Young boys would make spears or weapons and practice throwing things accurately, and young girls would practice or play with painting, craft, and storytelling. So the games they played were according to the sexes. At puberty, women were a marriage commodity. A commodity because once they were promised to a man, then that man had to provide food on a yearly basis back to the family. And so, yes, they were a marriage commodity. Women, however, were very, very respected as breadwinners. Often the men were away for weeks at a time hunting in large groups. And at that time, the woman in the family was the only person providing food. She was the breadwinner. So women could fish, they could hunt for very small animals, and of course they did all the gathering of any of the fruits and vegetables that a family needed. They bonded very, very tightly as they went out hunting and gathering on a daily basis while the men were away. I did say that young girls, once they reached puberty, were a marriage commodity, but it was only the mother in the family who could decide on the man that her daughter would marry. The father had no say or right to speak whatsoever. So the major role in deciding a marriage partner was with the woman. And in any funeral ceremony, it was the woman who played the major role. So compared to Western women, Aboriginal women were very independent at that time. At the same time, in England, for example, women in society were being trained in etiquette and the right thing to do in society, and to look good next to a husband, and stay at home and just learn home crafts. The Aboriginal women at this time were independent, they were the breadwinners, and they were making decisions, for example, about marriage, which was really not happening in Western society. Aboriginal people in Australia have always been a strong part of our sports team, and many famous sports people in all teams are of Aboriginal descent. Here we can see one of our most famous Australian football players, Adam Goodes, and he's playing there with another Indigenous player. The ball skills in Australian football of the Aboriginal people is so high that they are very highly sought after by most of the Australian football leagues around the country. So in Sydney, Victoria, Western Australia, a huge percentage of the players are of Aboriginal descent. We have Cathy Freeman, who was a 400 and 800 metre gold medal winner at both the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games. In basketball, they are also very highly skilled. This is Patty Mills, who is currently one of the top-ranked players in the American Code. He is incredible, not very tall, but an incredible ball player. And in Australian Rugby League, we have two of our most well-known Aboriginal players. This is Jonathan Thurston, who is just retiring from the Code this year, and here he is alongside Greg Inglis. You can see that they are wearing special jerseys here. This was at the end of beginning of a match that they hold every year in Australia, where all the Indigenous players from all the different states in Australia come together in one team, and they play the non-Indigenous players. And the passion for the game at that time as an Indigenous person, an Australian, but an Indigenous Australian, is really evident, and it's very strong. And to finish with, we're going to look at the Brisbane tribe, the people who lived for thousands of years around our local area and who still do. These people are called the Turrbal or the Jagera people, and they still own the tribal custodians of a lot of the land that we live on here. Their whole area that they occupied from year to year was covered about 3,400 square kilometres. They would always keep coming back to where Brisbane is now because of the predominance of food. You have the rivers, you have the ocean, and you have quite tropical land where it was quite easy to get food. Very important that the land belonged to the whole tribe, not to any one member of a tribe, and everybody collectively looked after the land and owned the land. Like all Aboriginal groups, they were survived by hunting and fishing. They mainly in this area hunted snakes, lizards, goannas, and this is a goanna we see here. Goannas look like a crocodile, but they are not human or flesh-eating. They mainly eat eggs, but they do have sharp claws, so you never corner a goanna. They hunted possums, and these live in the trees. They're arboreal creatures who live in the trees all over Brisbane. They hunted kangaroos. They hunted birds, and here we have on the left our lovely galahs, and this is a bush turkey. And you will see these bush turkeys still all over the Brisbane area from time to time and all up and down the coast. They gathered fruit and vegetables. As I said, this area was quite a rich area for all of these things to grow. And there was plenty of food, so they did not need to move away for very long periods of time from these tribal lands that belonged to them. Thank you very much for listening to the lecture this week, and we hope you learnt a little bit about our First Australians, our Aboriginal people. And remember to click on 2 links. You have a reading task to complete, and then you also have the vodcast task that you will need to do to be marked present for this lecture. We hope you enjoyed, as I said, and we look forward to having you with us again for the lecture next week.